Hey everyone, this is Chris from Surreal Seeker Workshops, and in this tutorial we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about the histogram. First, as you can see, we're in the Develop module, and now we're going to take a look at the histogram up here. The histogram is both very important when shooting and in post-processing, but we're going to talk a bit about why it's so important in shooting, and this is going to be the demonstration. So real quick, if you're not familiar, the histogram is the graph that shows you where your pixels are in the image. What that means is it reads left to right, and it shows you where the blacks are, where the shadows, where the midtones are, where the highlights, and then the whites. And then these spikes in the graph show you how many of those pixels are in that area. So for example, in this image, we have almost very little in the midtones, we have a fair bit in the shadows, and we have a good bit in the highlights and a touch into the whites. And one of the reasons why learning the histogram is so important, mainly in the field shooting, is because if you clip too far to the left in the blacks, or even worse, too far into the rights, what happens is we can't really recover those pixels in post-production. Clipping pixels on the left side is a little bit more forgiving in the sense that you can underexpose an image and then process it with a darker color palette, darker tones, etc. But whenever you clip the whites, they're gone. They just become gray at best. So it's important not to clip the whites when possible. And now a quick reason why I'm going to show you the demonstration on this image. So this autumn image from the June Lake area in California shows what is a fairly bright sky and fairly dark tones down here. Now if you look at this in the field, especially without a histogram, you're going to have a hard time judging if in fact you expose this properly. And before I get too much further, I will say I'm shooting with the D800, and I bring that up because that camera has a massive amount of latitude and dynamic range, which is validated in the histogram. As you can see, it covers both a wide range from darks to lights without losing on either end. Not every camera is capable of capturing that entire range, but with that said, most cameras will do a better than well enough job. So let's do a quick process on this. As you can see, this is the raw. I haven't done anything yet, and again, I keep pointing out what this histogram looks like. So I'm just going to show you the after of what I've done. And I want to show you both the effects and the histogram. Now watch on the histogram when I revert it back. And now the processed version. As you can see, there's still pixels down here and fairly up here, but what's happened is we filled in the middle. We've balanced this image. And this is why it's important to know that if you can capture an image in the field with a histogram like this, you not only can recover everything, but you won't have to bracket it. So in the land of HDR and blending exposures, if you know your camera and your histogram, it's very possible to achieve results similar to HDR without, in fact, blending images. So I'm just going to run you through real quick what I in fact did here. I'm not going to focus too heavily on it because I do have more in-depth tutorials on how to process your images, but I do want to give you a quick run-through of how we went from this raw, with this very spread out, but arguably perfectly balanced histogram, to this processed version. So let's go back to the raw. First thing I always do is come down and set your camera profile. If you don't do this first, you change it later. All of your adjustments up here will in fact shift and possibly be incorrect. So I'm going to match this back to the settings that I had that I just showed you, which were a slight bump in color temperature, a slight bump in exposure, and the way I work, I always do highlights first. I'm going to bring back, and boom, right away, that's one of the biggest adjustments. We're going to bring back almost all of those highlights that in the field may have been lost, but we know via our histogram were in fact not. I'm going to bring up the whites. I'm going to bring down the blacks. And I'm going to leave the shadows as I do for last. You'll see why. I'm going to come down to clarity where my standard is about 20-25. You can see it really punches things up. My standard vibrance is usually a 10. Same with my standard vibrance of 20. And I say standard because I have a fairly definitive style in which I process my images from the start, and I encourage you to develop a similar starting point. Not everything's perfect for every image, but that's just usually my starting points. Let's come down to the tone curve here. And let's drop those highlights down a touch. And this is going to be one of the biggest adjustments. Watch closely as I bring down the lights. Boom. So now I've recovered again all those pixels that were never gone, thankfully, and they're nice and balanced. And this also is going to be a nice jump here. We brought back the darks there, and also bring back some of these shadows. And now to the top again, because remember we left the shadows for last, and this is exactly why. Take a peek. Boom. And I believe I actually had the whites too high before. We're going to bring those down. Much more balanced. Alright, before we get any further, just to show you what we've done so far. This was the raw. And now, with just the first two panels, we've been able to create that image. And that again is all because we've understood that our starting histogram was in fact a very good starting point. Nothing lost in the blacks, nothing blown out in the whites, a ton of room to make that image look wonderful. And now we're just going to polish up in the Luminance Slider. And I'm just going to go through the Luminance Slider quickly, mainly because I have a much more detailed and involved tutorial specifically on the Luminance Slider, the powers of it, the uses, and so on and so forth. So let's just take a quick pass here. We're going to drop the oranges a touch, as you can see, balance those out. Let's bring up the yellows for some contrast. And now let's bring down the greens for even more contrast. Nice and punchy. And I will say this, I won't go past the blue one very quickly because this is the last frontier, if you will, for reclaiming the sky in which we had a lot of room to work with. So if I bring this blue slider down, we'll do it in an aggressive manner. You can really see how much room was still there. That's a bit much. You can see it kind of halos around the edges. So we're going to undo that. And I'm actually only going to bring this down about a 15. And that's a bit more subtle and natural. So there we are. That's a quick rundown of why we pay a whole lot of attention to the histogram, mainly in shooting. It's imperative that you understand it to maximize your image, so when you come back here, you know that you in fact have all the room that you need to work with. Alright, thanks for following along. For more tutorials and for full info on workshops, please visit surrealseekerworkshops.com. And until next time, cheers!